They say money doesn't buy loyalty, but in my world, it was the only language anyone ever spoke. The day I found out my salary was frozen, I didn't scream. I didn't storm into the boardroom. I just stared at the email, a single line of corporate frostbite. Due to liquidity adjustments, all executive compensations are temporarily withheld. Temporarily. That word felt like a smirk. I was the chief treasury officer of Arcton Holdings, a $6 billion conglomerate with offshore subsidiaries in 4 countries and enough hidden liabilities to sink a small nation. I had built their credit lines, managed their debt structures, and quietly saved them from 2 near insolvencies. Every major deal they'd boasted about had my signature buried somewhere deep in the paperwork. And now, suddenly, liquidity adjustments? I knew exactly what that meant. The company wasn't broke. They were testing me. Someone up there thought I was replaceable. By the time I closed the email, my pulse had steadied into something cold and measured. This wasn't panic. This was calculation. You see, in corporate finance, power doesn't come from the corner office. It comes from the clauses nobody reads. And I had written half of them. I didn't know who gave the order to freeze my pay, but I had a strong suspicion. 2 weeks earlier, I'd rejected a backdoor request from the CEO, Lionel Crane, to reclassify a $20 million transfer to an affiliate in Dubai. The numbers didn't match. The ownership trail was murky, and I refused to sign. He'd smiled then, that thin politician smile, and said, "Sometimes it's better not to look too closely, Evelyn." Now, it seemed he'd taken that personally. What Lionel didn't know was that he'd just pulled the wrong thread. Because hidden inside, Arcton's debt structure was something few people truly understood, a cross-default clause that tied our offshore loans together like a row of dominoes. One breach in any subsidiary agreement could trigger a cascade, freezing assets across continents, calling in debts overnight, and legally forcing creditors to seize control. It was a nuclear button in financial form, and I was the only one who knew exactly where the detonator was buried. I remember sitting in my office that evening, the city skyline reflecting off the glass walls like a mirage of power and greed. Everyone thought they were untouchable. The CEO with his private jet, the board chair with her family trust, the auditors pretending not to notice the numbers that didn't add up. But I had spent a decade quietly building the architecture of Arcton's empire, and I knew every joint, every fault line, every point of collapse. They thought freezing my salary would make me desperate. Instead, it made me dangerous. When I walked past the finance floor the next morning, I noticed the shift, the way people avoided eye contact, the whisper that moved faster than any memo. News travels strangely in offices like ours. The scent of power loss is sharper than blood. Lionel called me later that afternoon. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Just temporary, Evelyn. You know how these things go. We'll resolve it soon." I smiled into the receiver. "Of course, Lionel. Just keeping the company solvent, one freeze at a time." He chuckled, not realizing the irony. That night, I opened my private archive, an encrypted drive labeled Aurelia. Inside were copies of every credit agreement, collateral mapping, and covenant crosslink I'd ever drafted for Arcton. There, in cold, perfect language, lay the skeleton key to the company's existence. I ran my finger along one particular clause I had written years ago, one that tied our Asian subsidiary's bond issue to a European asset trust, under a single line of shared default liability. If I triggered that clause, even accidentally, every lender from Zurich to Singapore would have legal grounds to freeze Arcton's assets pending audit. And guess what? Once an audit begins, personal bonuses, executive funds, and offshore transfers are all locked, including Lionel's. It was elegant, brutal, and absolutely legal. The only question was, did I want to destroy them? Or make them beg? As I sat there, the city lights pulsing against my window, I realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Just focused, precise. They had frozen my salary, but soon I'd freeze their empire, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger. Just a single email, one clause, and the world they built on deception would crumble under its own weight. The beauty of revenge in finance isn't the explosion. It's the silence that comes before it, when they still believe they're safe. And I was about to make sure that silence lasted. Just long enough to watch them fall. They thought I'd panic. They thought cutting my pay would break me. Instead, it gave me the perfect cover. For weeks, I moved like a ghost inside my own company. Present, useful, trusted. I chaired cash calls, recalculated covenant ratios, and answered auditors' questions with the same placid voice everyone relied on. They saw the Evelyn they always did. Calm, competent, grateful for a chance to prove her loyalty. No one suspected I was cataloging every misstep, every shady transfer, every friendly meeting that had nothing to do with the balance sheet. My first step was simple: confirm the trail. Public filings are a map full of blanks. The real paths are in emails, side letters, and the little memoranda executives call housekeeping. I tapped into minutes of off-site meetings, expense reports that read like coded messages, and the internal ledger entries where the affiliate in Dubai was never more than a line item labeled consulting. Each falsified sentence tightened the rope around them. There were two people. I worried about Lionel, who had the temper and the hubris to make reckless moves, and Mara Delaney, the board chair, who wore restraint like armor and covered dirty deals with legalese. Lionel was impulsive, which made him loud and obvious. Mara was surgical, the kind who arranged the stage while someone else pulled the strings. Together they were a perfect storm. I also checked my allies. Finance had people who owed me favors, a mid-level counsel, Reese, who drafted SPVs, a treasury analyst, Leah, who still thought I'd mentor her someday. I needed them to believe in routine. I didn't recruit soldiers. I nudged them into normalcy. Routine is a better disguise than conspiracy. With the cross-default clause in mind, my setup had to be elegant and deniable. Triggering a clause doesn't require malice, only proof of default. So I began a quiet choreography, tighten textual interpretations, flag overdue notices on a subsidiary's bond covenant, and make the small administrative choices that would, in aggregate, look like governance correcting course. Every email I sent, every memo I signed, built a paper trail that later would seem like standard treasury housekeeping. I also prepared a contingency: access. If anything went sideways, I knew how to lock down data trails. Years ago, I'd built an encrypted mirror of Arcton's critical agreements, not for revenge then, but for control. Now it was insurance. I copied key clauses to private servers, labeled them with neutral names, and distributed decoy copies in places Lionel would never think to check. Emotionally, I kept my distance. The freeze was personal, but the plan would be structural. Revenge that tastes like humiliation is messy. Revenge that looks like justice tastes cleaner. I sharpened my patience until it gleamed. Then I waited for opportunity. A missed covenant payment, a sleepy audit, a late filing. I cultivated those tiny slips by being the unassuming administrator of consequence. I nudged deadlines, requested clarifications, and sent formal inquiries that, on paper, only an officer of Treasury would do. When Lionel sneered, "Paperwork will fix this," he didn't realize I was using paperwork as a scalpel. When Mara tightened her smile in board meetings, she didn't know I'd already cataloged every trust and transfer that braided her family's fortune with corporate assets. They had frozen my salary to remind me of my place. I was going to return the favor by teaching them the place of consequence. The setup was set. The next moves would be quiet, legal, and devastating, the kind that left executives alive but stripped of everything that let them pretend they were untouchable. The first crack sounded like bureaucracy, an overdue notice flagged by an overworked custodian in Singapore. Nothing that should have worried anyone. Except it wasn't a mistake. It was the perfect hinge. I'd quietly marked a covenant that most people never read without a lawyer on speed dial. A coverage ratio tied to an operational metric in our Asian subsidiary. The metric had been flirting with the covenant line for months. My memos nudged them on the margin. Nothing blatant, just precise reminders that procedures must be followed. Those reminders were now a chain of small, undeniable failures. When the bond trustee sent their formal query, the legal team called it routine. Lionel called it a paper hiccup. Mara called for calm. I called it progress. Conflict doesn't always thunder. Often it creeps in through phone lines and PDF attachments. My inbox filled with responses that were equal parts indignation and damage control choreography. Lionel barked orders to the regional CFOs, demanding explanations with the kind of fury he used to hide the fact he hadn't read a spreadsheet in months. Reese, trying to appear helpful, redrafted indemnities that only deepened the knots around our offshore trusts. The market smelled it. A quiet investor whisper in Zurich turned into a soft sell-off. Credit default swaps ticked upward by basis points, invisible to most, but a siren to anyone who knew how to read them. Arcton's rating committee convened. Fingers hovered over the emergency protocols, and the board's steady confidence began to show hairline fractures. Employees started to talk. People who once smiled at Lionel in the corridor now crossed the street. Rumors spread the way credit risk does, quickly and with contagious fear. My phone stayed calm. I answered as the Evelyn they expected. Rational, slightly amused, implacable. I couldn't be seen as the cause of panic. Panic is what makes people make mistakes. And mistakes were the currency I needed. The first real flare-up came from an unexpected quarter. Our Singapore trustee demanded documentation on a supposedly ancillary pledge. It was a routine ask on its face, the kind of checkbox that usually gets a perfunctory upload and a thank you. But when the trustee dug deeper, they discovered an earlier side letter, a reclassification of assets that had never been properly disclosed to certain creditors. That discovery triggered a legal cascade. One creditor asked for an independent audit. Another declared a technical default. Overnight, the cross-default clause I'd studied for years went from abstract to active. Letters arrived demanding redress, instructing custodians to freeze accounts until disputes were resolved. In the boardroom, Lionel's tone changed. Where his voice had been brooking no opposition, it now fretted over optics and counsel. Mara's mask tightened into absolute control. Terse emails, delegations, a parade of external consultants flown in to reassure stakeholders. But their gestures were reactive. Theater responding to a script someone else had written. Conflict is a pressure test. It shows the weak seams. Ours began to reveal institutional rot. Shell companies with no clear beneficial owners. Transfers routed through jurisdictions designed to obscure, and a habit of treating legal constructs like costume jewelry, decorative but meaningless. I watched it all with a clinical curiosity. I was not cruel. I was surgical. Every scandalous ledger entry they had hidden became a spoke in the wheel of legal consequence. I quietly compiled the trustee findings, the creditor notices, and the audit requests into a dossier that, to anyone reading casually, looked like compliance housekeeping. To anyone reading with intent, it read like a body of evidence. They accused each other in hushed meetings. Lionel blamed the Treasury. The regional CFOs blamed bad reporting. Mara blamed market overreaction. Meanwhile, my frozen salary sat in a temporary ledger line, a little triumph for them that tasted like dust to me. The real conflict was not between me and them. It was between the empire they'd built, brittle and perfunctory, and the legal scaffolding that held it together. I had pulled at one small thread. The fabric began to unravel. And as the first trustees moved to place temporary holds on assets, I felt the inward calm that comes before a verdict is delivered. The fight had started, but it was no longer a skirmish. It was a contest of documents, timelines, and interpretation. And in that conflict, precision would win. They had frozen my pay to humble me. I had in turn frozen their certainty. I always thought betrayal would sound like a slammed door or a whispered confession. But in corporate life, it arrives as a calendar invite titled Emergency Governance Meeting. It was 9:45 a.m. when I entered the boardroom. Glass walls, perfect lighting, and the faint scent of panic disguised as professionalism. Lionel was already pacing. Mara sat at the head of the table, still as ice. Around her were lawyers, risk officers, and an unfamiliar man, a restructuring consultant from London. The kind they called when the company was burning and they needed someone to say it looked like steam. I took my seat, calm, expressionless. The consultant cleared his throat and began reading. Due to the ongoing investigation into technical covenant breaches, we recommend suspension of Treasury authority pending review. My signature authority, my access, my entire operational reach. gone in a paragraph. Lionel didn't meet my eyes. Mara did, briefly, her expression smooth as marble. It's procedural, Evelyn. You understand. Until we get clarity. Procedural. The same word she'd used months ago when they approved that Dubai transfer I refused to sign. Now, suddenly, I was the liability. For a moment, the air felt heavy. Not with fear, but with recognition. They weren't just freezing me out. They were framing me. The consultant spoke again. There are internal documents linking recent communications from Treasury to the activation of cross-default triggers. We need to establish intent, a word that can ruin a career or redefine it. I leaned back in my chair, fingers interlaced. So let me understand, I said slowly. You're suggesting that I, the person who saved this company twice, deliberately caused a default that exposes your off-book transfers? Lionel snapped. Watch your tone. And there it was. The crack. The fear in his voice. The panic of a man who knows exactly how much truth is buried under his own name. Mara intervened quickly. No one is accusing you, Evelyn. But optics matter. We have to appear transparent to the regulators. Appear transparent. The choice of words told me everything. They were building a wall between themselves and the fallout. I was the perfect scapegoat. High enough to look responsible. Low enough to be disposable. As the meeting ended, I collected my things with surgical calm. Every eye followed me, waiting for outrage, for weakness, for emotion. They got none. Because while they stripped my access from the system, they didn't know I had something far more valuable, the keys to the architecture itself. That night, I opened my personal vault, the Aurelia archive. Inside were not just copies of contracts, but digital trails. Encrypted proof of Lionel's transfers, Mara's trust transactions, and signed memos disguised as consultant fees. Every piece was admissible, time-stamped, and irrefutable. But betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from someone you once trusted. Reese, the legal counsel I'd quietly mentored, had been the one who handed over my treasury logs to the board. His email to Mara was buried in a thread I intercepted days later. She's too calm. I think she knows more than she says. He was right. I stared at his message, not angry. Just disappointed. Everyone has a price. For Reese, it was a promised promotion. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as justice and started calling it what it was. War. They wanted to make me the villain of their downfall. Fine. I'd play the part perfectly. Because when they made me their scapegoat, they gave me the one thing I needed most. Distance. And distance, in finance, is freedom. From there, I could act without suspicion, outside the lines of corporate control. The betrayal they thought would break me had, in truth, cut my leash. And the moment that meeting ended, my real plan began. Not to survive their scheme, but to end it, not with noise, with precision. Revenge, I decided, would not be a spectacle. It would be a legal choreography so exact that when it finished, everyone would insist it had been inevitable. I drafted the plan like a deal memo. Objective, numbered, impossible to misconstrue. It had 4 pillars: containment, leverage, disclosure, and extraction. Each one fed the next. Together they were a loop designed to strip their defenses down to bare contracts. Containment first. I could not afford to be the obvious architect anymore. So I constructed plausible deniability. I routed communications through fiduciary channels, used third-party trustees who owed me nothing but billing invoices, and fed the right documents to the right custodians at precisely the right time. I positioned myself as a bystander of compliance, the woman who had dutifully raised concerns, and then retreated to let independent processes take hold. That way, when auditors and trustees came calling, their inquiries would look like routine escalation rather than an engineered assault. Leverage was the cruel but necessary second pillar. Lionel and Mara had spent years converting influence into obscured assets, family trusts, nominee accounts, last-minute reclassifications. My Aurelia archive held the maps, but accusations alone do nothing. You need pressure points. Lenders who could call loans, trustees who could freeze collateral, counterparties whose contracts contained the precise language that made a default contagious. I quietly cultivated those relationships, I opened discreet lines with an independent trustee in Singapore, reminded a European bondholder of a tiny covenant that had been ignored, and let rumor, channeled through neutral third parties, create just enough attention to make creditors nervous. Disclosure was the artifice that would finish them. I did not want a court drama. I wanted regulatory scrutiny that would immobilize them. Regulators react to patterns, not to single sins. So I compiled the dossier. Timestamped transfers, side letters, undisclosed pledges, and the chain of beneficial ownership linking board families to allegedly third-party vendors. Then I drafted a neutral cover letter, facts, questions, and an invitation for audit, and sent it through counsel with impeccable phrasing. The letter did not accuse. It asked for verification. That's the trick. Make them invite the investigation. Humans convinced of their own innocence will answer anything. And when they answered, they signed confirmations under oath. Extraction was the final quiet step. Once trustees and creditors had invoked protective actions, assets would be secured and governance would shudder. My goal was not to take what they had, not directly. I wanted the collapse of their pretense. Board seats vacated, family trusts exposed, shareholder confidence evaporated. When that happened, the market would do the rest. Stock dips, activist inquiries, and emergency. Votes to replace leadership. Executives who once moved like unassailable giants would become figures in a restructuring deck, their reputations collateral for their hubris. Tactically, I set the clock. Covenants had notice periods, trustees had response windows, and markets had rhythms. I timed the disclosures to coincide with quarter-end reporting, so their options would be constrained by deadlines. I also seeded redundancy. Simultaneous audits across jurisdictions ensured that no single legal maneuver would stall the entire process. If Lionel tried to buy time in London, a trustee in Singapore would already have a hold. If Mara attempted to restructure by fiat, bondholders would demand immediate cure clauses be satisfied. There were human elements, too. I knew who would crack under pressure and who would not. Reese had sold his silence for a title. His conscience could be bought back with exposure avoidance. Leah, the analyst, had always been loyal to the craft. I protected her through the plan, making sure she had a safe path if she testified to what she'd seen. I never endangered those who had been naive allies. My war was with those who weaponized the company's structure for personal gain. I also prepared an exit narrative, the version of events that would survive press scrutiny and legal parsing. It would read like governance done right, an independent audit revealing historical lapses, the board stepping down in the name of accountability, creditors working with a cleaned-up management team. No melodrama, no vengeful epilogues. The public story would be regulated, sober, and crucially, believable. In the weeks leading up to activation, I pretended to remain small, answering emails, signing innocuous memos, playing the part of the sidelined officer. Inside, I monitored trustee responses, creditor positions, and market ripples. My salary remained frozen, a petty victory for them, but my hands were on the levers that mattered. When the moment came to initiate, it would be a whisper, one neutral letter, one trustee notice, one bondholder query. But the structure I'd put in motion would amplify that whisper into a legal storm. No violence, no theatrics, just the inexorable language of contracts doing what contracts do, enforcing consequences. They had underestimated the power of clauses. I had spent my career writing them. Now I would use them to reclaim what they had taken from me, piece by precise piece. The day everything tipped felt ridiculous in its mundanity. A string of emails, a trustee's signature, a registrar's stamp. No shouting, no dramatic scene, just the quiet, absolute mechanics of law taking hold. At 0912, I saw the first confirmation. The Singapore trustee had accepted the independent audit request and issued a temporary hold on the pledged assets. It was a clean, bureaucratic line in a PDF, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Around the same time, a European bondholder declared a technical default and accelerated repayment clauses. Creditors who had once smiled at our lunches were suddenly reading covenants as if their livelihoods depended on it. Because they did. Lionel didn't understand the problem until his private accounts started answering with silence. He tried to make phone calls that went nowhere. His office staff answered with rehearsed calm. Mara moved like a queen whose crown had been quietly removed, polished, measured, utterly unable to stop the invisible machinery closing in. Shareholders needed answers by noon. An emergency notice hit the market. Arcton's stock would be suspended pending further disclosure. Trading halted. The press smelled it and circled like vultures. The difference was that vultures do not read contracts. Analysts, however, did. Overnight, terms that had been buried as routine were pulled into sunlight. Reese called me that afternoon. For him, the pressure had become moral as well as professional. "They said you engineered it," he whispered. I didn't want to lie. His voice broke, the first real sound of surrender. He agreed to hand over internal threads showing personnel instructions from Lionel regarding the Dubai transfers. It was the admission I needed to close a loop. Leah, who I'd shielded, provided a testimony about a late-night upload she'd been asked to perform and the code name used. A tiny breadcrumb that linked transfers to a family trust. With those pieces, counsel drafted a submission to the regulator that read like a sober audit, not a vendetta. Documented side letters, timestamps, undisclosed pledges. The regulator moved faster than PR could spin. They demanded interviews under oath. They issued preservation orders. Board members found their personal trusts under the microscope. The safety nets they had painstakingly woven around private assets began to fray. Lionel made one last move, an attempt to decree an internal restructuring and reassign authority in an emergency board memo. It was theatrical and legally hollow. Trustees and bondholders ignored it. The contracts that mattered followed different loyalties, to trustees, to creditors, to the plain language of agreements. Legal truth, not presidential edict, prevailed. By evening, the board had been forced into a temporary stand-down. An independent committee was appointed. Investors demanded new leadership. Where there had been confident smiles and private jets, there were resignation drafts and lawyers with briefcases. I watched all of it from an office that suddenly felt too bright. My salary was still frozen, a petty late detail that tasted absurd now. I had wanted them stripped of the illusion that they were untouchable. I had not wanted spectacle. The climax was not a shout, but a rearrangement of power. Trustees in control, creditors negotiating, and the board humbled into accountability. As the legal engines churned and the market digested the facts, I felt a strange emotion I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a cool, precise satisfaction. The moment wasn't about revenge's theater. It was about consequence. Contracts enforcing the terms they had been built to enforce. And somewhere in the hush that followed the worst of the storm, I realized the most important part of what I'd done. I had proven that the empire they had built could not survive its own corruption. By the end of that quarter, Arcton Holdings was no longer the fortress it had once appeared to be. The press called it a controlled unraveling. Investors called it structural cleansing. I called it justice, hidden neatly behind audit terminology. Lionel resigned first. His statement was crafted by PR, full of personal reasons, and time to explore new ventures. He left the building in silence, flanked by 2 compliance officers who politely asked for his company badge. A week later, his accounts were frozen by court order. Mara held on longer, a statue refusing to crack, until the regulator's findings reached her family's trust in Zurich. One sealed document was all it took for her to retire with dignity. In her final message to the board, she wrote, "We must prioritize transparency and corporate integrity." I almost laughed. The irony was flawless. The interim committee reinstated my position quietly, not out of sympathy but necessity. Someone had to stabilize the wreckage. I accepted, but not for long. My goal had never been to rule the ruins. I just wanted to ensure they could no longer rebuild their lies on top of mine. When the final report was released to shareholders, it read like a textbook on poetic accountability. Cross-default clauses, fiduciary breaches, undisclosed interests, all cited, all verified. There was no villain's name, no hero's triumph, just the cold, objective truth of numbers correcting themselves. In the silence that followed, I cleared my desk. No dramatic farewell, no applause. Just a quiet elevator ride down 38 floors, each one a layer of memory I was ready to shed. Outside, the city still glimmered, indifferent, efficient, eternal. Arcton's logo still shone at the top of its tower, though soon another name would replace it. I didn't stay to see which. They had taken my salary, tried to erase my worth, and used betrayal as currency. But in the end, the very system they manipulated became the weapon that undid them. That's the truth about power in finance. It never belongs to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to the ones who write the clauses everyone else ignores. When the chaos settled, and the last of the seized assets were liquidated, I stood in the same office where my journey had begun, this time as the rightful interim CFO appointed by the board. They wanted me to stabilize the company I'd once been betrayed by. Irony has a strange sense of humor. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. Justice wasn't about titles. It was about balance. Months later, I heard Ethan and his partners were fighting lawsuits, their reputations beyond repair. And me? I moved quietly into a private advisory role, helping whistleblowers expose corporate frauds just like theirs. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. It's methodical, precise. A single clause that turns arrogance into ashes. This is revenge untold, where silence is sharper than any sword.